You know, we don't, it seems like the, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Edible Education 101, Class 5 of the 2019 semester. It's a delight to be here. We've got the first plum blossoms opening this week. And I just thought before we get started, I wanted to dedicate tonight's class to a dear friend who passed away just about a week ago. Jim Shore was a beloved member of our faculty, one of the people here to teach social entrepreneurship. I had the great pleasure of serving alongside of him on the Net Impact Board for a decade. And he went on to Vanderbilt University to found their social entrepreneurship center. So in just his memory, he supported so many students to direct their business careers for good. And I thought, especially with our special guest tonight, Danny Meyer, it would be appropriate to remember Jim. So this class started about 8 years ago at the insistence of Alice Waters. And I just wanted to recognize Alice tonight and express my gratitude. This class has been in different parts of the university over the years. I'm really happy that it's found a home here at Haas and that we're able to really invite and serve so many different students from across the campus, and then of course the local community and our online community. And Alice taught me many years ago that the best way to transform the food system is to feed someone a compelling and delicious idea. So I always take that to heart, and I especially wanted to bring Alice one of my favorite fruits tonight. This is from the Buddha's hand tree, so here you go, Alice. So thank you, Alice, for getting edible education going. So as you recall, this year's class is really titled Take Action, and with the recent reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change really urging us to action, that climate change is happening much faster than even the best scientific models have predicted, combined with some Lancet reports that just came out in January. The Lancet actually named that we have a syndemic, which is 3 pandemics coming together in undernutrition, overnutrition, and climate impacts. And it turns out that food is literally and figuratively a low-hanging fruit opportunity for intervening in the system. And we've been taking a lot of guidance this semester from Donella Meadows' work in the how to intervene in the system. And I just, for our guests' benefit tonight, I wanted to just share the 3 core intentions of the class, which you're all familiar with. But one is to develop food systems intelligence. This is really getting an understanding, peering through the opacity of the food system to understand how everything is linked and to start to understand how different tools and different levers can affect change on a personal level, on a community level, a state level, federal, and a global level. Also, an intention is for each of us to become an enlightened eater. This is to wake up from our habitual kind of coma and pay attention to what it is we're doing. I thought this was also particularly appropriate given that our guest tonight is part of his philosophy is about enlightened hospitality. So we're going to learn more about enlightened eating and enlightened hospitality. And then the third intention really is to equip each of you and prepare you and cajole and encourage you to be able to create your own take action plan to feel courageous, empowered, and capable to making real change in the food system. Each week we have a different guest come. Last week we had a session on the Farm Bill. We had 3 speakers. It was really fascinating. We had the public policy view. We had a local community organizer. And then we had a woman who had recently got her degree here in public policy and is working in public health. But this one graphic really stuck with me. I kept thinking about this all week, this just massive disconnect between what one part of the USDA is recommending to be our daily allocation of food, with half of it being fruits and vegetables, and then the chart to the right being the subsidies that the USDA provides to different foods. And if you notice, it's less than 0.5% of the whole budget that goes to actual farming is dedicated to fruits and vegetables. And it's like, when you scratch your head and say, how can this possibly be? Well, it's because there's a lot of incumbent interests. There's a lot of patterns that haven't been changed, but it calls to us that the food system that we have now is just not in sync with the challenges and the demands that we're facing in overnutrition, undernutrition, and climate. So I also wanted just to introduce to those of you that aren't familiar with it, here at Berkeley Haas, at the business school, we have 4 defining principles. And every year, I actually try to identify a speaker to bring to the business school who I think exemplifies those principles. And I thought I'd just review them with you. Question the status quo. You'll find that our guest tonight absolutely does that. What does that mean, question the status quo? It means I'm not satisfied with the way things are, and I'm not just going to resign myself that they always have to be that way. I'm going to bring critical and rigorous thought and action to bear to see where there's a better solution. Confidence without attitude, one of my favorites. This is to always remember that humility is a form of energy, and that we succeed in the world with empathy, with open ears, and really learning. And that goes into the third one, students always. When you get a chance to look at Danny Meyer's book, you'll see it's full of reflection. He tells you the stories of his learning by doing, and then reflecting, and then incorporating that learning into everything he does. And finally, beyond yourself is thinking about being a steward, operating business, leading business with integrity and an ethical compass. So it gives me really great pleasure tonight to introduce you to Danny Meyer, who's come all the way from New York just to be with us tonight. Danny is the CEO of the Union Square Hospitality Group. His operation and organization has received, I think, more James Beard awards than any other. He's received the Julia Child Award for profound contribution to American culture of how we eat, how we cook. And he's written this wonderful book called Setting the Table, which really for anyone is much more than a book about eating and food and restaurants. It's really a philosophy about how to create a culture of care and enlightened hospitality. So without further ado, please welcome Danny Meyer.
Thank you so much, Will and Alice. How would you like to be giving a talk with Alice Waters in the front row looking at you? In Berkeley, I might add. It's kind of an amazing thing. It's really, really great to be here. I was first at Berkeley, soon after graduating with a political science degree from Trinity College in Hartford, because one of the things I thought maybe I wanted to do was to become a journalist. Why? Because I always liked watching the news, and I always cared about the issues. I grew up at a time when every night Walter Cronkite was on TV, and we were talking about a president who had some ethical issues. We were talking about a war that maybe we should not have been in. And I had an extremely Republican dad and an extremely Democratic mom. And I was the middle child of three in an extremely middle of the country state called Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, which back then was truly a purple state. And the dinner table every night with me at the center was the place that we not only ate food and learned about food, but we argued. And we learned that the table was a place to work things out with people. And we didn't have devices that we could use as a way to stop talking to each other. We had to work it out, but it was always around food. And the funny thing was that the food was often pretty good. My dad and I used to like to cook all the time. My mom was a decent cook. Our dog, whose name was Ratatouille, no kidding. Not many kids in St. Louis had a dog named Ratatouille in grade school, junior high, and high school. But that dog ate all of our scraps, so there was no waste whatsoever. And we learned that food is what brought us together. We started here, and the food brought us together. You could not sustain an out loud argument with a really good piece of fried chicken in your mouth. You just couldn't, because you couldn't stop smiling at the same time. I didn't know it, but the entire time that I was growing up and talking about food and actually getting an education unwittingly, because we had French people living in our home, because my father was in the travel business, designing driving trips through the French countryside to stay at these inns, which back then were called relais de campagne. Later that became known as relais and chateau. And the young sons and daughters of these innkeepers would live in our home, and they would work for my dad by day to translate for the customers that were buying his tours. And at nighttime, there was always a bottle of Beaujolais on the table, so much Beaujolais that when my dad and I were out barbecuing in the backyard, and he would lose his attention and the flames would whip up on whatever we were cooking, he would just take a bottle of Beaujolais to douse the flames. That's how I grew up. Now, let's fast forward to Berkeley. I didn't decide to apply to go to journalism school, and it's probably unlikely that I would have been accepted here if I had. So it's a big thrill for me to be back here. I'm not coming to Berkeley to talk to you that much about the food part of the restaurant dining experience. You've had many others who I think are far more expert than I at doing that. It's something I care deeply about. I am at the very, very basis someone who loves the pleasure of the table, and I love what the table does to bring people together. And I know that good food has the power to do that. But what I really want to talk to you about is another equation that is not the plant and it's not the animal, but it's the people. And it's the part of the system that I can't say it's more broken than every other part, because there's plenty to fix when it comes to what finds its way to the plate. But how did that get to the plate in the first place? And how is it that our system, in this country especially, has made it so broken? That's what I want to talk about tonight. And I want to hopefully talk about some of the things that I think we can all do and advocate for and experience that can possibly be part of the solution at the same time. I want to go all the way back to the first experience that I had when I first paid for a meal on my own. You can probably all remember that. I'm not talking about you guys who grew up in the age of fast casual food, but if you think about the first time you ever went to a full-fledged restaurant experience with somebody serving you, and you felt like a grown-up, and maybe you went out with a friend, maybe you were not with your mom or your dad or whoever it was who was paying for you, and you got to that point where the check was delivered, and you said, how do I figure out the tip right now? What am I supposed to do? How much is it? I know my mom and dad said it should be 15, but sometimes I do 17.5, and sometimes it's 20%. And am I supposed to tip on top of this bottle of wine? I don't know what to do. And you write the thing, and the entire experience doesn't feel quite right. It doesn't feel quite right because maybe you gave too little, or maybe you gave too much. And maybe the person on the receiving end expected more. Or maybe the person on the receiving end doesn't express the gratitude back that you had hoped to hear at that point. Now think to 5 days ago when you went to a local coffee place and there's that tip jar out in the front. And there's often a dirty $1 bill taped to the front to make sure that you know what that can is for, in case you missed it. And then every now and then you see a bunch of 20s stuffed in there, probably not by guests, but you know, it's an old auctioneer's trick. If I make you say, well, I'm not going to give a 20, but at least I'll put in a 5, that's not a bad way to go about it. And you get your cup of coffee, and the coffee is whatever they charge here. New York would probably be $3.25. No, it would be $3.28. And now you go, okay, I could be really cheap and give the 2 cents, but that won't feel good. I could give 52 cents, and that'll feel weird. And no matter what I give, it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be appreciated, and they don't deserve it anyway. Have you ever had that experience? It just doesn't feel clean. It just doesn't feel right. Now I want to fast forward. You heard Will say earlier that one of the things that in business, I think it's really important to do if you're going to be a leader in business, is to question the status quo. And we begin almost every business discussion we have when we're trying to envision a new way of doing business by asking a question, which is, whoever wrote the rule? Whoever wrote the rule that the way it was always done is the way that it always needs to be done, and the way it always should be done? Whoever wrote that rule? And we've applied that thinking as well as another type of thinking, and I'm going to explain this one for 1 minute. With the second question, in addition to whoever wrote the rule, is this. I think that most businesses, at least any business I've ever been involved with, aspires to being the best it can possibly be. It's not just going through the motions. Now, that's not to say that you can't go to a local hardware store, let's say, that aspires to serve its community and doesn't aspire to be the best hardware store that the world has ever seen. They're still providing a great service. But in my business, we have 26,000 restaurants in New York. I just have zero interest in being a non-essential, also-ran restaurant. It would be like being a songwriter and not caring if anybody really needed to hear your song again. If I were a songwriter, I would want to write the kind of music that you would want to keep in your digital collection, and you're a good editor because you know what you like and you know what you don't like. And furthermore, amongst your digital collection, I would want to be the kind of songwriter that wrote the song that made you feel better, the song that made you say, my life got better because that song was written. And that's what we want to try to do with restaurants as well. So if we're going to do that, we have to ask a second question in addition to whoever wrote the rule. Because if you keep playing by everybody else's rules, you're going to do what's always been done. And it may not be the best way for the product or for the world. The second question, though, is how can we become the company that, if only it existed, would put us out of business? Because you can bet that there's someone who does want to put you out of business. Because every time you do something that leads the pack, people take notice, and people take notice more quickly than they've ever taken notice before. So you can bet that someone is shooting for you and aiming for you. So how can we become the business by questioning the status quo and being better at the things we do? How can we become the business that, if only it existed, would put us out of business? And then you get to keep looking in the rearview mirror, which is a lot better. Now, how does this all relate to tipping? And how does it all relate to labor? Let's talk about the unsustainability of the current system we have. My philosophy is called Enlightened Hospitality. And it's very, very simple. It is a belief that no matter what the organization, whether it's a restaurant or a hardware company or a college, a university, we all have the exact same 5 stakeholders, all of us. And the real question is, in what order are you going to prioritize your stakeholders to create the best possible chances for a good, sustainable outcome? So what we've learned that we've done at our restaurants, and we work really, really hard to be intentional about it, is that we actually turn on its head by asking whoever wrote the rule 2 of the things that I learned growing up. Growing up in St. Louis, all I ever heard about was the most important stakeholder. And by stakeholder, I mean anyone whose life could be impacted by the existence of your business. That's what I mean by stakeholder, or your organization. All I heard growing up was 2 things. The customer is always right, and it's all about service. Guess what? I don't believe that. I think it's hogwash. Then when I went to go take my 1 economics class at Trinity College, we learned about a University of Chicago professor named Milton Friedman. Has anyone ever studied old Milton? And Milton believed that the number 1 most important stakeholder is the investor. Because if you make every decision based on what you think the investor most wants, that will create the most rational outcome for your business altogether. And we said, hogwash. That's not true either. And so in Enlightened Hospitality, we created a different pecking order, not as a vertical list where someone's at the top and someone's at the bottom, but as a virtuous cycle where if you start here, one good thing keeps leading to something even better. And in so doing, we learned that, number one, not only is the customer not always right, because no one's always right. How could the customer always be right? It's demoralizing to tell your staff that the customer is always right. In fact, it can be dangerous sometimes to tell them that. We put our staff members first, and we put our customers second, and our community third, and our suppliers fourth, and our investors fifth. And we don't put our investors fifth because we don't want to make money. As a matter of fact, because it's a virtuous cycle, if you break this anywhere, you've broken the whole thing. The only way ultimately to take great care of your staff members and the people who work for you is if you have happy investors. If your restaurant or your business is not making money, no one's getting raises, no one's getting promotions, and the business shrinks. And I should know, I've closed 2 restaurants in this past year, having closed 1 restaurant in the first 33 years of my career. 2 restaurants in this past year. And I can tell you that in almost every case, I've probably hung on longer than I should have for a counterintuitive reason. I hung on because I didn't want people to lose their jobs. What I was doing, though, was trading on their loyalty, because if I waited 2 years too long, that meant that for 2 years, those people were not getting promotions or raises. And that's not fair. What I learned each time we did close was you can actually close a restaurant and a business with as much distinction as you open one. How? You hold job fairs amongst all of your restaurants. You invite the alumni of your restaurants. And if you've been doing it as long as I have, there's a lot of alumni out there. You invite them to come hire your staff members. In every single case, anyone who was an employee in good standing got another job, either within our company or in somebody else's business. And a lot of those people go on, and it's kind of like it's good for them to leave the nest. Some of them come back after that. But now let's get back to what I've seen in 33 years of being a restaurateur, actually 34 years coming up this year. The disparity in what cooks and tipped employees can take home has grown by 300%. How can I be a business person whose philosophy is enlightened hospitality, which means we put our employees first, but we really only put our tipped employees first? And in fact, even that's an illusion. We're not even putting our tipped employees first. How can I preside over a business that if it were a football team and we come back to the locker room after the first half of the game is over and we're behind by 20 points and I'm trying to motivate the whole team and the offense is making 3 times as much as the defense and they're all supposed to feel really good about that? You can't do that. It's not sustainable. We have laws in this country that are sometimes even at odds with, in fact, many cases, at odds with laws that go state by state as to who can and who cannot receive a tip. There are some, in fact, there was just a labor ruling from the U.S. Department of Labor this past week that is completely at odds with the law in New York State. And I know exactly what's going to happen. And that law has to do with who may and who may not receive tips. And I can guarantee you, because of that confusion itself, all over tipping, the U.S. federal law, as of this past week, now says that they're overturning the Obama era, which said they had something called the 80-20 rule, which means that if you spend 80% of your time on the restaurant floor in a guest-facing role, you may legally receive tips. If you spend 79% of your time on the floor, in a guest-facing role, you may not accept tips. Now, who is out there with a stop clock watching 80, 79, 75, 20? Cooks may not receive tips in New York State. Dishwashers may not receive tips. Reservationists may not receive tips. Baristas may not receive tips. Maybe you've noticed, maybe you haven't, but more and more restaurants over this past decade have put their barista station where the barista's facing the guest, because now I'm facing the guest 80% of the time. Not necessarily legal. There are all kinds of law firms who go trolling for opportunities to seize upon the confusion between all of these laws in a way that does not help take care of employees. It helps the law firms, it hurts restaurants. So instead of presiding over a system that has been completely broken, differently than the beginning of my career, I actually wrote an article for the Union Square, not the New York Times, for the Union Square Cafe newsletter in 1994, all about the evils of tipping. And I was too timid to do anything about it. Now, what I was upset about in 1994 was that there was not a night that I did not have a waiter or a waitress sobbing at the end of the night because somebody had left the restaurant stiffing them on a tip. Sometimes it was somebody from Europe or Asia where there's not a tipping culture, and they honestly didn't know how we do it. Sometimes it was somebody who had had too much to drink and just could not add. Sometimes it was somebody who was genuinely trying to make a statement, to punish something that they don't even know the cause of. My steak was overcooked. Great, punish the waiter for that. Take away their income. So back in the 1990s, I wanted to get rid of tipping because I thought it was just a horrible thing to have thousands of different employers for my staff when I'm the one who should know who is doing the best job of providing the best hospitality. Who's the waiter and waitress who knew the most about wine and about the food, who can answer questions the best? Who are the best salespeople? In a tipping system, in most fine dining restaurants, the tips are actually shared equally amongst all of the tipped employees. So when you think you're punishing bad service or you think you are rewarding good service, you're actually not punishing or rewarding the person who delivered it to you anyway. And meanwhile, let me tell you what the real culprit is. The real culprit is that because of the American tipping system, which is uniquely American, it was a way post-Civil War for two industries, the restaurant industry and the Pullman train car industry, to avoid paying for the people providing service by saying it's not slavery because we're going to get our customers to pay them instead of us. And what that led to was not only a deeply ingrained culture in our country where people felt empowered as customers to either punish or reward, or just to go along with the status quo, which is actually what most people do. There are many, many studies that show whatever you tip, you probably tip 95% of the time. If you're a 20% tipper, doesn't matter if I'm good, great, or beyond expectations, I'm not getting 20%. If you're a 15% tipper, you're probably my grandmother, but you're probably always a 15% tipper. So here's where we are today. How do you get a raise if you're a tipped employee? If every tipped employee is receiving the same base minimum wage, which now, and I think you guys all did your homework by looking to see what the variances are state by state by state, there are still, I believe, 20 states in this country where the adjusted minimum wage for tipped employees is $2.13, meaning that the way you make money is to be maybe just a little nicer to that guy, whether he's a nice guy or not. And that could be the difference between whether you can pay your rent or not. I just think that's plain wrong. I just think it's plain wrong. So how do you get a raise? If most fine dining restaurants share their tips amongst everybody, how do you get a raise? You could be the best server and you're still going to be sharing the tips with everybody. You get a raise in a tip house by staying at the restaurant for more years than everybody else has. And what you get for your longevity is the lucrative Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night shift, as opposed to the newcomer who gets Monday lunch when the restaurant's not very busy, or Monday dinner. Now, how about you as a restaurant goer? How does it feel to you to know that when you go to a tipping restaurant and you happen to be out on a Monday night, you're not getting the A-team? You might get lucky, but that A-team person's probably going to get promoted to Tuesday and then Wednesday and then Thursday as the week gets busier and busier and busier. How would you like to be a server who finally made it to getting the Friday, Saturday night shifts, and now you've got a family all of a sudden, but you can't afford to not work on Friday and Saturday and Sunday nights. You can't afford to be with your kids at that point without taking a deep pay cut. But now let's talk about the people who are legally not allowed to accept tips in most states in this country. The people who are not in the dining room. Let me ask you a question. How fair is it, do you think, that on a cranking Saturday night, when all those wonderful tipped employees, and by the way, they didn't do anything wrong here. I'm talking about the system, not the people. On a cranking Saturday night, and the restaurant is doing 200 covers, which is our parlance for serving 200 people, relative to a Monday night when maybe we served 75 people, they're taking home a heck of a lot more money, while the cook who made the risotto only gets to perspire a little bit more. Same exact hourly rate as they were making on Monday night. Now, how does it feel if the tipped employee, because the guest decided that they wanted to go for the black truffles with a $30 supplement, right? The same tipped employee who could have brought me Parmesan cheese, but now gets to, the cook is going to put some black truffles on top, now gets an extra $6 in their pocket because of what the cook just did. It just doesn't add up. It's not right. And here's the real culprit, ladies and gentlemen. Because we have been doing this for so long and not questioning it, not questioning the status quo, the entire pricing structure of restaurants, the menu price that you see, is absolutely bizarre. Can you imagine going to a clothing store and whatever the tag is that's hanging off the sweater you're about to buy, or the coat you're about to buy, or the pair of pants you're about to buy, is the price for all of the cotton that went into it, all of the labor that went into sewing it, etc. All of the marketing that went into, merchandising this to the store. And then at the end of it, you had to write a 20% extra to pay for the person who brought the pair of pants to the store before they got hung up. It just doesn't add up. The price of our food in a restaurant is so artificially skewed because we're not charging for the full effect of what it costs to bring that food to you at the table so that you can be with people and have a wonderful time and have an uplifting life experience. And what's happened over my almost 34-year career, and the reason that we've seen exactly mirrored in the restaurant industry the thing that we've seen in our country, only to a much greater extent. This huge income gap that we are presiding over, and we bear responsibility for presiding over it, is because of this. The artificially low prices that we pay as consumers based on how much competition there is amongst restaurants and how much competition there is for your food dollar no matter where you get it. What that means is that every time any type of expense goes up for the restaurateur, it could be the rent, it could be the florist, it could be the linen company, it could be the detergent we use to wash our dishes, it could be insurance, it could be the cost of the food itself. But every time any price goes up in the cost, we raise our menu prices, right? Wouldn't you? Every time we raise our menu price, who benefits? The tipped employee, because the tipped employee continues to get a 20% kicker on the menu price, which has only gone up over the course of my entire career. But what happens to the non-tipped employee? Because restaurateurs hate raising prices. We hate it. We don't want to risk losing your business because you know that a roast chicken should not cost more than $26, and you know you're going to take another $6 out of your pocket at the end of the meal, but you don't do that calculus. You just know that it should cost $26. And so when we raise that price because we have to $27, we'll be damned if we're going to raise the cook's salaries at the same time, the hourly compensation, because we can't. That's the one thing we can control. We can't control the landlord. We can't control whoever raised the animals, whoever grew the grapes for the wine, but we can control our own costs. And boy, have we controlled it. And so this incredible income gap, which I think is going to destroy our industry unless we can find a way to bring it together, has to be addressed. And I frankly got tired of questioning Washington and saying, why can't you change the laws? Or questioning governors and mayors and saying, why can't you change the law? Because they haven't and they won't. Part of the reason they won't is that our NRA, the National Restaurant Association, is not only one of the most powerful and effective lobbying organizations in the country, it's also one of the oldest, if not the oldest. And the larger restaurant businesses who pay the dues are deadly afraid that they're going to be put out of business, either if the adjusted minimum wage comes up, as it has here in California, as it is beginning to in New York at the same time, or they're afraid that it's just going to break the entire economic system. So tiring of trying to get others to do the job, I just asked the same question that I asked in 1990 when I said, whoever wrote the rule that we need to have smoking in restaurants, and we just eliminated it at Union Square Cafe, even though our restaurant association said, if that ever becomes law, no one will ever go to a restaurant in New York again. They'll all go to New Jersey. Didn't happen. New Jersey has some good restaurants, but it did not happen, I'm just telling you. That didn't become law in New York for 12 years, 2012. And I frankly didn't care because it was the right thing, and I knew it was the right thing. Can you imagine having smoke blown in your face like we used to? We used to be handed 3 packs of cigarettes on airplanes, or at least my parents were when I was a kid. They used to smoke on airplanes. Can you imagine that? But here's the same thing. Whoever wrote the rule that you need to have tipping? Whoever wrote the rule that if Alice Waters and the many, many people that she has led over her career have convinced us that the pleasure of the table is so much greater when the food was grown closer and more responsibly to where you're eating it, and you actually know the person who grew it, and convinced us that it was worth paying your farmer a little bit more for better food. And we went with that. And our consumers went with that. And we also did the same thing in the world of wine. And we've done the same thing in the world of spirits and of beer. Why wouldn't we do that with people? Why wouldn't we accept that the same exact principles that we've said, we want it to be better. We want more pleasure. We want to treat people and plants and animals better. We can do it. I'm going to just try to explain to you for one moment, and I think Will and I are going to have an opportunity up here for some more questions, to just share what is tough about it. And I'll go into a lot more depth, but only if you ask. What's tough about it is two things, the culture and the math. The cultural part is trying to convince people that what they've been doing all along doesn't actually work. I will never forget, we held town hall meetings and invited any of our guests, regular guests who wanted to come, to ask questions when we started to embark upon the elimination of tipping, which we call hospitality included. And the whole point of hospitality included was to say, why in the world would you be expected to pay more money to be treated nicely? Isn't that our job? Do you pay extra if the fish you ordered came the way you asked for it to be cooked? That's our job to do that. So from a cultural standpoint, the early questions that I was getting from people were, well, how can I possibly be assured of getting good service if I don't have the opportunity to punish bad service? Of course, I hated that question, because if you think about it, and I actually asked these people when they would ask, well, have you ever had bad service in a restaurant? Yeah, and I punish it with a bad tip. Well, I said, well, then I guess the tipping system didn't prevent getting bad service, right? It didn't. And as a matter of fact, the bad tip with which you tried to punish the bad service was shared equally amongst everybody as a shock absorber, and you don't even know what bad service is or why you got it. Was it bad service or was it bad hospitality? And they'll say, well, what do you mean? Well, if it was bad service, it means we probably didn't get the right food to the right person at the right table at the right temperature at the right time. Or maybe we made you wait for your table too long. Do you know that that was your server's fault? That would be bad service. Well, what's bad hospitality? Well, did you feel like the server was on your side? Would you ever want to be served by somebody? And those, raise your hand if you've ever worked in a restaurant. Good, a lot of you. When you were working in a restaurant, did you ever look at your station of 5 tables? Be honest now. And you looked at them and you said, which one is going to give me the biggest tip? That's the one I'm going to be nice to. I'm not going to be nice to anybody else. Of course you didn't do that. But there are people, and we know this for a fact, in the tipping system, who actually do try to gauge, and sometimes they're not even aware consciously that they're doing it, which table, by their looks, by their gender, by their race, by their age, which table is likely going to give me the highest tip. And I'm going to be nice to everybody, but I'm going to spend a little bit more time there because that's where the riches are. Guess what? When you eliminate tipping, you eliminate that entire dynamic. It just goes away. Or have you ever been a guest in a restaurant? Have you ever been a guest and wondered, is the only reason that person's being nice to me because they think they're going to pick my pocket at the end of the meal? I love the Japanese word omotenashi. Has anyone ever heard that word before? Come on, give me one hand. You got it. And it is even more than hospitality. Omotenashi, as I understand it, is the act of anticipating another person's needs and delivering on those needs as its own reward without further expectation of more after that. And when you eliminate tipping, you don't have a reason to reward or punish anything because that is who is working in the restaurant. And so from a cultural standpoint, the best thing about this is that anyone today who applies to work in our restaurants applies knowing that this is the system and this is what they want. Has it been hard for legacy workers who might have spent 7 or 8 years trying to get that Friday and Saturday night shift only to learn that the rug was pulled out from under them and that the tipping system is gone? You bet it's been hard. And that leads to what's hard mathematically, because I want to do it all. I want our staff members to be happier. I want our cooks. I want to start to narrow that gap that has been growing and growing and growing. Not only do I want to stop it from growing, but I want to narrow it. That's a 20% raise right off the bat for cooks. I also want to get rid of the dead end that tipping causes. It's a drug. The dead end is that a tipped employee can actually make enough money that they never actually want to grow because they can't afford to grow, because managers make less money than tipped employees. It's a dead-end job. And I know too many people, wonderful human beings, who got stuck on that for too long, and their life has moved on. And now it's a little bit late to go take that next step. It's hard for them. How do you get the math right for your staff and get it right for your guests, so your guest who's used to seeing $26 for the chicken doesn't start squawking when they see the chicken just became $34? And how do you explain to every guest that, oh, well, by the way, it would have been $32 if you tipped 20%, and that extra $2 is helping our cooks in the kitchen and paying for a very generous parental leave policy so we can have a holistic approach to this. And actually, we're kicking up our starting manager's salary so that we encourage people to pursue this as a sustainable career. Oh, and by the way, if you're making your staff members happy and you're not raising your prices to the point of shock to your guest, how do you make your investors happy, the third stakeholder? So it would be disingenuous of me to say that any of this has been easy. But I don't think anything worth doing ever is easy. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope I have provoked some questions. I'm going to start with Will Rosenzweig. Thank you very, very much. Okay.
Let's go sit over here. I was struck, well, thank you very much. I was really struck when I was reading your book again about the long view that you've taken, and we now live in a culture of really instant gratification, very high expectations about how quickly things should scale up. I mean, we are also in the force field of Silicon Valley here, where scale is such a valued attribute of business. But you talk about how you were very almost cautious with you had your first restaurant and you didn't want to open a second restaurant for a while. And so talk to us a little bit about how you think about when's the right time to grow. What do you need to know and understand?
Yeah, well, I think my view has absolutely changed, obviously, because you've heard me now say 3 times that I've been in this business for just a little bit over 3 decades. After decade 1, I had 1 restaurant, Union Square Cafe, and that was more than enough because I needed to learn the business, learn the community, grow roots, and develop soul. And I think great restaurants have to have soul. And the way you get soul is, and I love this metaphor, but I remember as a kid when I would go to the sporting goods store, and every 4 years I would get a new baseball glove. And of course I wanted the most expensive glove. My dad would always talk me down to the 3rd most expensive glove. They smelled great, the stitching was beautiful, and you'd get this glove home and you couldn't play catch with it because it was so stiff and not broken in. And I feel like the way a baseball glove gets broken in is by playing catch. And it becomes not just the glove that was made originally, but the glove itself becomes a reflection of your hand and the way you catch, but also a reflection of who threw the ball and how hard and where it hit. And that's what great restaurants do. They become a dialogue that changes what the restaurant actually is, and that takes time. And so I think it took me 10 years to figure that out. And then Gramercy Tavern was restaurant number 2, and then it was 4 years later before opening 2 back-to-back restaurants, 11 Madison Park and Tabla, that opened within 4 weeks of each other because they were in the same building. And then the floodgates got let open. And the reason the floodgates got let open, which then in rapid succession led to Blue Smoke, our barbecue restaurant, Jazz Standard, the Modern up at the Museum of Modern Art, and then Shake Shack, and then Maialino. And the reason the floodgates opened is that, and I think this is a virtuous cycle, not a vicious cycle, but aspirational people want to grow. And what I found for years and years and years at Union Square Cafe is that there's this very, very strange balance in a restaurant. In the same way that we want to confuse you as a guest, we don't want you to know whether you went out or you came home. I feel like we kind of do the same thing with our staff members. We want to blur the lines between going to work and being part of a family. And I hate losing family members. And so at Union Square Cafe, I wasn't going anywhere, the GM wasn't going anywhere, the wine director wasn't going anywhere, the chef wasn't going anywhere. And so at a certain point, aspirational people had to take the off-ramp. And I got so tired of that that I finally said, let's open Gramercy Tavern. And once you have a base of 4 or 5 of those restaurants, you start to have a lot of shoots that you either grow them or you lose them. And so the impetus to open a new place is some combination of having the right idea and the right place to do it and the right people who are pushing me and saying, I got to grow or I'm leaving. Now, sometimes we do lose great people. And I've kind of learned that that's not a horrible thing. It's actually a good thing for them. And some of them come back and they bring great new learnings that they got in somebody else's restaurant.
I was looking at the trends of restaurant sales, and it seems like it's declining. So it sounds like a lot more, well, more people are eating at home than, say, they were 10 years ago. But it's unclear whether the meal delivery service is contributing and being counted as a eat-at-home meal, even though restaurants now are increasingly investing in the technology and the infrastructure to get those meals to people at home, as you were talking about earlier. What's your view on this whole restaurant delivery?
My Uber view, pun intended, is that that more and more people care about good food than ever, and that's a good thing. I think that we did have a conversation before this, and that is that when I got into the business, you really had 3 choices. You could eat at home, which meant you were shopping for your food in a market of some type, and then you were chopping it and preparing it, and then you were cooking it. That was choice number 1. Choice number 2 was you could go out to a restaurant, and that restaurant was either going to be a very special occasion restaurant, which usually in New York anyways was started with le, la, or il, or you could go to a casual restaurant where you did not expect to eat very well. That was kind of it. And now look what's happened. We knew back then that there were many places where eating was a necessary amenity. And captive audience places like ballparks and airports and airplanes and hotels and museums and on and on and on, shopping malls. They all had a place you could eat because they had to, because you needed to fuel yourself. But it was lowest common denominator food at highest possibly charged prices. And that was captive audience dining. It is dead now, and that is a great thing. So people who can afford to go to museums and take trips and go to ballparks don't want to park their good taste in food on the side. So the good news is, while we may see restaurant as we know it, sales declining, it's not that fewer people are eating well. More people are eating better than ever. There's just more ways of doing it. There are people who don't have the interest in going to a market. I would hate, like, I never bought into the notion of these meal kit companies where you can eliminate me from getting to go to the green market, eliminate me from getting to use my own cookbooks or my own taste memory or my own refrigerator or whatever my own is, by putting these little packets together with instructions, and you know, I can take all the packaging and throw that out while I'm at it. And it just, but there's a lot of people doing that, and so many that exploded. When I grew up, the only kind of food delivery was pizza or Chinese food, and now you can get anything. There are 8 delivery companies in New York City alone, and many of them are attracting enormous funding because people want it faster and cheaper. Now, any architect or contractor you've ever worked with has taught you about the rule of 2. And what happens, I know this from designing restaurants and apartments, you design your dream place. And they go, sounds good, I got that material, yep, that's great. And 2 weeks later, they say, here it is, and you look at the plans and they go, and here's how much it's going to cost, and here's how much time it's going to take. And you go, you got to be kidding. Well, and then they all go, well, you know the rule of 2, don't you? And they say, well, the rule of 2 is that quality, speed, and price. Which 2 do you want? Because you can only have 2. And our industry has done that for way too long. And I think one of the good things right now is that we are saying, whoever wrote the rule, that the only way to get to 2 is 1 + 1 + 0. And so what you're starting to see, and especially in the category that I call fine casual, where a lot of chefs who are very, very well trained, who care deeply about the ingredients they're using, are saying, you know what, it could be 3/4 plus 3/4 plus 0.5 can get us to 3. In other words, we're not going to give you a waiter or waitress, but we're not going to tamp down the quality of the food, and you're going to get to save the money while we're doing it. So you're seeing that in every possible category: salad, Mexican, pizza, Greek. Everyone is trying their hand at saying, all right, you know what? And by the way, smiling and offering hospitality doesn't cost an extra penny, so I can still be nice to you, but I'm just not going to give you a tablecloth or a reservation or flowers or a bartender or a maitre d' or a reservationist or a sous chef or a pastry chef. And when you take all of those costs out of the experience, but you still use really, really good ingredients and really good recipes, you're starting to see a ton of that. And where is that impacting? That's impacting fine dining restaurants in a big way.
And you call that fast casual?
I actually call it fast casual, but what you're increasingly seeing is what I call fine casual, where it's a mashup of people who were brought up in the fine dining full service industry saying, we can actually learn systems from fast casual more quickly than fast food can learn taste from us. And that's why you're seeing an explosion in that category right now.
I've noticed in your career, not only questioning the status quo, but actually going against the grain and taking like a lot of heat for it. I mean, I mean, if you Google Danny Meyer,
please don't.
Everybody already has, and they see that, you know, you draw a lot of fire. I mean, there's a wonderful section of your book where you're talking about just dealing with restaurant critics, but you haven't shied away. I mean, there's a lot of heat. And what advice do you have for people who want to go against the grain, want to change an entrenched system, and know they're going to come up against sort of either existing cultural norms that people don't understand? We think a lot here like, well, gee, if people just only had the information and the logic, they would make the right choice. But it just doesn't seem like that plays out in food all the time. So
yeah, I'm not expert at this game, even after all these years, but I would say two things. When you know something in your heart to be right, and you say, and every day I do it the other way just because that's how everybody else does it, and you can't really look yourself in the eye. When you look anyone in the eye, it's a direct line between your heart and their eyes, and you've got to tell the truth. If you can't look yourself in the eye, you got a real problem. And it's generally not easier to do the thing that is the right thing. It's generally not. So that's thing number one. But then number two is if you are going to challenge the status quo, do it with love in your heart, because I just think that in the same way as I think the fuel behind Alice's food movement has always been that you really want to eat that food. It's better. It's hedonistic. And I think love is hedonistic. And I think that it may take longer to make change. But if you're doing it because you know it's right, and you got love in your heart while you're doing it, it's worth it.
Thank you. When we were preparing for the class, I asked you, what do you want the students to read? And you said, without hesitation, I want them to read the first couple chapters of Saru Jayaraman's book, Forked, because that really lays out the inequities, inconsistencies in this system that you're talking about. And we've just got some wonderful questions from some of the students tonight. So I wanted to see, is Julie here, Julie Tran? Julie, come on up and introduce yourself to Danny and the class. Tell us what you're studying.
And I'm a senior studying environmental economics and policy. Here, I'll just grab this. Thank you for your talk, Mr. Meyer. It was really enlightening. I have a really long question, I'm sorry. So, as one of the most powerful and influential people in the restaurant industry, you have used your position to pave a revolutionary new approach to dining in your restaurants called Hospitality Included. Many might argue that chains and other large restaurant groups, rather than small local establishments, are better suited to try a no-tipping strategy, since they have more free cash flow in case of emergencies. However, these large groups are currently the ones who are lobbying towards keeping unfair wages and standards, and therefore the movement towards fairer and higher standards in the industry seems to be at a standstill. Who do you think is the next player that needs to step up for us to continue striving towards one fair wage in the industry? Thank you.
Oh, Julie, thank you. It's a tough question. They usually say it's a great question when they know the answer. It's a tough question when you don't know the answer. You should pay attention whenever someone says that's a great question. They already know the answer. I want to challenge the first part of what you asked. I don't think that larger businesses necessarily have more free cash flow, because what are we? We are a collection of restaurants that have exactly the same kind of economics individually as everybody else. However, I've always believed that, to Will's point about Googling my name, we punch above our weight. We are actually seen as being even larger than we are. And with that comes responsibility. And so when we made the decision to eliminate tipping, it was an incredibly scary thing mathematically. You may or may not know it, but the government actually gives restaurateurs an entire tax rebate of sorts if you accept tips. You get a tax credit if you accept tips. And that started, I should know, but I'm going to guess it was about 15 years ago or so. There was a moment in time, 15 to 20 years ago, when the government said, here's a great way to increase our treasury because we know that most tips, or many tips, are not being reported. Cash tips were not being reported. Even some credit card tips were not fully being reported. And that meant a lot less income tax collected. And so what the government did, I guess it was smart, was they decided to put the restaurateurs in cahoots with the government, and they said, for every dollar in tips that your staff reports, we are going to give you a tax credit of X%. So they gave us a commission for every dollar we reported of our staff's tips. When we eliminated tipping in our restaurants, and at that time we had 10 restaurants that accepted tipping. This was before Shake Shack was a public company, and Shake Shack never had tipping, never had a tip jar, never will. But we learned that from our accountant that when we eliminated tipping, we would then eliminate the tax credit we would get. $1.1 million a year we had to give up by doing this because we thought it was the right thing to do. And I do feel a responsibility as a leader in our industry, and I accept that. I'm proud of it. I accept it. When we screw up, we deserve more blame than everybody else. And, you know, hopefully, to answer your question, I don't know a one person. People like Saru and Rock who have been out there fighting like crazy. We've had so many talks about this over the years, and we approach it in a different way. But it takes activists, it takes business leaders, it takes government, and it takes consumers, and it takes students. It takes people to say, it doesn't have to be this way. But here's what our role is as business people, and I know this. I can do this, and if it puts us out of business, and there are nights when I go home and I go, how are we going to make this all add up? Because it's not easy. But the way that we can convince people to come along is the same thing that happened with smoking, which is that our restaurant, Union Square Cafe, and then later Gramercy Tavern, and even our jazz club, got busier and busier than every other jazz club that had smoking. And when people look at your business and say, they're better restaurants, there's less turnover there, meaning the food is better, the service is better, I get recognized more, I feel like I belong more, and I'm willing to pay for that. And when people see that we're doing well and our investors are continuing to invest in our growth, and we keep bringing in more people to this system, there will be a critical mass moment when people look and they say, this actually works. But until we can prove that it works, we're only just starting. So I don't know who it is. I think it's a lot of people, and it sure would be nice if we could get some enlightenment from government, because that's how you really scale it in a big way.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to that, but just a quick interlude. One of the really favorite topics of the class is around plant-forward diets and meatless meat, and here you've got Shake Shack. Do you have a meatless burger yet? Or how do you think about that whole space? Well, what's going to happen?
So when we opened Shake Shack, it'll be 15 years ago this coming summer, everyone said, you got to have a veggie burger. And I had never had a veggie burger that I craved. And so I just hadn't. And so we came up with this idea of doing a shroom burger, which is really delicious. Portobello mushrooms and shallots and cheese. And then we said, guess what? In the last 15 years, not only there are a lot more vegetarian guests, but there are a lot more vegan guests. and we can't make our shroom burger vegan. So just this past year, we started testing a veggie burger, and we have shied away from all of the laboratory things that are supposed to make you think they're meat, but they're really not. And we have made our own. And I believe it's now being served in Palo Alto as of about 3 months ago. It's not everywhere yet. And it's primarily grains and beets, and it's really delicious. It tastes. I wanted a veggie burger that wouldn't make me feel like I got gypped out of a shack burger.
Great.
So now I order one on the side of my shack burger.
We're heading down to Palo Alto after class. Emma Weston, are you here, Emma? Come on up. What are you studying, Emma?
I'm starting Haas next semester. I'm a sophomore. So in the first chapter of Fork, Saro talks about the restaurant industry's low minimum wages and the issues following that. And after reading the chapter, increasing minimum wages seems to be the only ethical and natural solution to these problems. But is there a risk that people become worse off if the government decides to increase the minimum wage, since the overall demand for workers by restaurants might decrease? Some restaurants argue that they will have to shut down their business if they have to pay their workers more. And in that case, the demand for workers will decrease and many people become unemployed. What is your perspective on that, and what can be done to avoid this from happening?
I understand both sides of the argument, and in fact, there are a good number of restaurants that are teetering on the edge of going out of business right now. Now, is that because minimum wage has gone up, or is that because there are so many more ways you can eat food other than going to restaurants? Full-service restaurants are way more expensive than they've ever been. And they're not only more expensive because of minimum wage. In New York City, which I know is only, my bubble, the rent that landlords are charging on the island of Manhattan has completely skyrocketed, and people are landlords are warehousing their spaces, waiting for the next upturn in business, because they know that they don't want to lock in a 20-year low. And so anyway, it's a long way of saying this. Whenever there's major tectonic shifts in the actual industry itself, I'm not just talking about minimum wage. I can get good food anywhere, and I don't have to go to a full-service restaurant to get it. That's the biggest question. It's not the minimum wage. And the reason that what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of there's an oversupply of full-service restaurants right now. But I also think that the people who are not working in the full-service restaurants, if one goes out of business, are getting jobs in other ways of eating out if they want to. The unemployment rate is pretty low right now. It's really harder than it's ever been to find people who have a heart for hospitality and a good work ethic and hands that know how to handle food at the same time. And so I'm not at all concerned that minimum wage is the cause for restaurants going out of business. I think you got to be better than you've ever been before, and that's what the biggest issue is. And I think the last part of your question, just remind me what that was, because it was a really good part. I apologize.
Here's if you want to see it.
Here, I can see it right here.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that, the impetus for raising a minimum wage has always been, let's put more money into the economy. And, I guess it's impossible to talk about this topic at the University of California at Berkeley and not get a little bit political for just a moment. But I think that some of the arguments that we get from politicians are just absolutely wrong, which is the rich did something wrong and you should just take it all from the rich and then everything will be fine. No, I think everybody should do well, but I will tell you this, that if you do not have a labor pool that is earning enough money to enjoy their lives and to put more money into the economy, you will break your entire society. And so I think the minimum wage is actually increasing is incredibly helpful. One more quick story. We believe in this so much that watching this wave coming to New York, really over the past 4 years, minimum wage has gone up little by little by little. We self-imposed a $15 an hour minimum wage at Shake Shack because we said to ourselves, we need to learn to do business in a $15 an hour economy. We don't want to wait till it's the law. And once it becomes law, if we have no experience and we end up scrambling, we could be in trouble. So we want to get a 2 or 3 year head start on this whole thing and see how it works. And guess what? You figure out how to make it work. So it's a long answer to your question, but it's not the problem. It's the challenge. The challenge is, actually it's good. Everyone's going to keep eating food. Everyone's going to keep being hungry and keep being thirsty. And so now the question is, well, how do they want it? And how can we do that in the most innovative and uplifting kind of ways possible?
Thank you. Thanks for your question, too. If you have another question, we would welcome it. You can come to any of the microphones, and if we have any questions from our streaming audience, please let us know. One of the things we really try to do in this particular class, Danny, is to present different perspectives of how to change the system. You're working from within with the platform of your businesses, trying to do the right thing, getting out in front of cultural trends, getting out in front of laws. And there are other levers, obviously, in the policy side, trying to change the laws, increase wages. We have a special guest here today. Sorry, would you join us up here? Yeah, can you? Yeah. Do you have a mic for Saru, or should we use? Oh, she's mic'd? Okay, great. This is Professor Saru Jayaraman.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, thanks for coming. Saru is on the faculty at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and she's the co-founder and director of the Restaurant Opportunity Center and the author of the book that you read part of, and has been working tirelessly. She's spoken at our class both the last 2 years, so if you want to learn more about ROC, you can watch one of the past lectures here at the Edible Schoolyard Project, where all the Edible Ed classes are archived. But I just thought you two are both champions and collaborators and working together, but not always in sync. And I just thought it would be really interesting, since you're here and we're at Berkeley, which is such a unique place, to hear a little bit about your perspective, what you're working on right now. Last time you were here, you were really focused on a couple of things. One is getting restaurants over the hump to adopt this, the higher road approach, and the other was really working with these states to raise that minimum wage. Mm-hmm. So how's it going?
Well, thanks for having me, and Danny, it's great to see you. So as you all know, we've been working, as you know, we've been working for the last 17 years since 9/11 to raise wages and working conditions in the industry, and certainly the moment that we met and Danny changed things in his restaurants was groundbreaking. So I just want to give a little bit of a trajectory to put what Danny did in context of how this thing has evolved over the last 6 years. So 17 years of trying to raise wages and working conditions in the industry, the last 6 years in particular, we've been focused on this issue of the sub-minimum wage and the fact that in 2019, we are still in a country where the federal minimum wage for tipped workers is $2.13 an hour. And I just, before we say anything else, the restaurant industry right now is the largest employer, 14 million workers, largest employer of women, largest employer of people of color, largest employer of immigrants, largest employer of formerly incarcerated individuals, largest employer pretty much period, and it gets to pay $2.13 an hour. And to me, that is an indication of the nation's value of women. What is the value of women if the largest employer in the United States of women gets to pay $2.13 an hour? So we launched the campaign in 2013 based on tons of research that we had done about California and the 7 states that had gotten rid of this system many decades ago that showed these states are actually booming. So I wanted to answer Emma's question. I mean, the greatest evidence that what you're proposing is mythology that's been promoted by the Restaurant Association is you live here. You live in this state which has the highest wages in the country and has had for 40 years and has never had a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers over those 40 years. And California has the largest and fastest growing restaurant industry in the country. Of the 14 million workers in the US, 2 million are here in the state of California, and our industry is growing faster than any other state. And so if it were true that paying people more somehow kills the business, then you wouldn't be able to walk off this campus and run into restaurants 2 feet from here. You wouldn't be able to see the kind of explosion in growth that we're seeing in this state. So the evidence, the live evidence, you don't even need to look at numbers. You have your eyes. Look outside. You can see, you can experience the fact that this state proves that that's not true. It's been mythology that's been proved forever. That's been promoted forever. So after doing that research and showing there's no side effects, in fact, there's so many positive things that come from paying people a full wage, we launched the One Fair Wage campaign. The real opposition, as you read in the book, has been the National Restaurant Association. So we struggled, and the first huge moment of victory, or change, was the president of the Ford Foundation sitting Danny and I down and being able to talk about the slave history of this issue and the sexual harassment, and being able to meet Danny's team and talk to them about the changes they wanted to make. And the thing that, Julie, you might not know, is that after Danny made the move, we counted 250 restaurant companies moving in this direction. So that has already happened. What you talked about has already happened. And for all the press we see about restaurants going back on, moving back from a gratuity-free model or moving back from paying a full wage, we've tracked it. It's less than 10% of the 250 restaurant companies that have moved in this direction that have gone back on it. Less than 10%. There are amazing small restaurants around the country that you haven't heard of. If you go to Chicago, go to Honey Butter Fried Chicken. Gratuity-free, best chicken in the city of Chicago. Excellent, very profitable, very, very successful restaurant company.
And nice people.
Really nice people. Zingerman's, one of the most beloved restaurant companies in the country in Michigan, gratuity-free restaurant, has not gone back on it. I mean, I could go and give you example after example, and people are doing it in different ways. Some are going gratuity-free, some are going to one wage and sharing tips with the whole house, some are moving to service charge models, but the movement is not stalled. On the contrary, we're seeing the number of restaurants. You asked, how's it going? We started with 200 restaurant companies around the time that I spoke here. We have 770 restaurant companies that are now members of our association, and they range from large chains like Cava Grill to small companies. And then on the policy side, this January, 15 states and Congress introduced One Fair Wage bills, and it's going to pass in the House of Representatives this spring. So there's tremendous momentum right now. It's not stalled at all.
Well, thank you.
Sorry,
Good work.
I didn't mean to.
No, it's so exciting.
It's all thanks to Danny.
Well, no, it's catalytic. I mean, and what I love is the way you both have modeled a collaboration, not always comfortable all the time, but you've both demonstrated that there are complementary and synergistic approaches to this kind of transformation of the,
Well
of the
put.
food system.
It's true. It's,
Yes.
it's very true.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things from last week that stuck with me also, when one of our guests was talking about the Farm Bill and the SNAP benefits, and she had a chart that showed the allocation of SNAP benefits, and it was extraordinary because the largest recipients of SNAP benefits actually are in
Food
the
workers.
food workers.
Yes, yeah.
So another great irony and misalignment of our policy and our system. So here we are depriving people of a living wage and then having to supplement through a SNAP program, which is very, it seemed from what I learned last week, kind of unstable and insecure if people aren't seeking work all the time, and there's a lot of provisions that people have to meet to know, to be confident that they're going to be able to eat.
I mean, what way we always say it is the people who feed us in America can't afford to feed themselves. They put food on our tables and they can't put food on their own tables. And I think the really important model and lesson, hopefully you're hearing from Danny Meyer, is the beauty of what Danny's talking about is that, you know, the workers in the fine dining restaurants that he owns, they're not the folks we're talking about that are on SNAP or on food stamps, but he knows that the change he's making has tremendous impact on the millions of other folks who are on food stamps because of the role he plays in the industry. And so what we always talk to employers about is your role isn't just about your business. You, as a business owner, have a tremendous outsized voice, even over the rest of us who are not business owners. You have a tremendous outsized voice. And last week we were in DC with 200 restaurant owners and workers, and Congress members were running to stand with us, and presidential candidates were, I mean, both Klobuchar and Harris ran to come, because the chance to stand with restaurant owners who are saying, we agree with raising the minimum wage like Danny does, is rare. And so restaurant owners have an incredible platform that other people don't have, and it's amazing when they're willing to use it.
I want to make a quick plug for students taking action, because we have a collaboration going on right now with 3 of our Haas MBAs working with your team at Rock to create a platform, kind of a toolkit to help enroll restaurateurs and reduce risks, reduce their fear, and come at it from not just a heart place, but really a numbers and process place. So I'm really encouraged by that, and I'm really proud that we've got that kind of intent here at UC Berkeley. You want to ask a question? Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jason.
Jason, good to
I'm a
see
business major. My question is for anyone that can answer this, really. What can a cook or a dishwasher do? Because I used to be a cook, and I remember I would never go to the managers saying, can I get a raise? Because I'm afraid. And I know a lot of immigrants and people of color, they don't have access to ROC United. They don't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about it until I came to this school, really. So what can they do to, basically have a better life? Thank you.
I wouldn't mind taking that to begin with. What's great is I've got a team here who will fill in all the things I miss. But this is connected to everything we've been talking about tonight. Our industry should feel really, really proud that as a first job, we have a really low bar. If you're willing to come to work, you can get some job in the restaurant industry. You don't have to know how to cook. You don't have to know how to, no one looks at your resume and says, how many dishes have you actually cleaned in your life? You can get a job. And then I think our industry has just as bad of a record at advancement, at career advancement. And I think a lot of it is institutional. We don't make it easy to learn how to ask for an advancement. What we've done in our company, really, and I'm sorry to say only over this past year, is to publish for everyone who works there what we call salary bands. And what it means is that for every single job there is in the entire organization, everybody can know where that job starts and where it caps out at, with a toolkit to help you understand how to take the next step to the next band if your aspirations are to make more money. And what's great about that is because it's transparent, you never have to fear wondering, am I the chump who's not getting paid enough, and assume that the person to your right is getting paid a lot more? Or am I getting paid less because I'm a different race or a different gender? Because the bands are colorblind and gender blind themselves. So we thought that that was one really, really good step towards doing that. Because what I want is for our industry, not, how can you have this many people employed and not want to see that kind of upward mobility? Yeah. And
it's funny because the industry, the NRA, the Restaurant Association, always says, oh, we don't need to pay people more or provide advancement because these are just young people moving on to something better. And how could any industry basically say everything else out there is better than us? That's basically what they're saying. You know, on the contrary, as an employer, if I had workers, and I do, who come to me and say, I want to know how to move up, I would embrace them, not run away from them. But unfortunately, the standard set by the chains is these are throwaway people, basically. They're just passing through to something better. And until our industry really recognizes that we're all professionals, from the dishwasher to the server to the bartender, we're all professionals, and really takes pride in the profession, then that won't change. But to answer your question, you know, we call Alice and Danny high road restaurant owners who take the high road to profitability. They believe that actually investing in the workforce is what creates profitability. It's not in spite of investing in people, it's because you invest in people that you see profitability. Unfortunately, the majority of the industry doesn't yet follow that path, and so for most of the workers you're talking about, they're not actually just needing to ask for a raise, they're often just needing to ask them to be paid. You know, we have the highest levels of wage theft and tip theft in our industry. The U.S. Department of Labor says the restaurant industry is the #1 source of these complaints and violations of the law. And so the best answer to an immigrant worker, a cook who's in a situation like that, is to be able to come together with other workers to speak up for justice and their rights. And it is only through getting support from an organization like ours that they can do that. So we are free and accessible and available. We have a legal center for millions of workers across the country, and that is the best. I mean, learning how to speak up for yourself together with others when you're not being paid is so important.
This is going to be an important evening for Jason because we spoke before class a couple weeks ago, and he told me he wants to go into the restaurant industry and he wants to lead it, and he's got a family lineage to carry on as well. So, how about another question here?
I don't know how I can follow that. Snaps to Jason.
Snaps for Jason, yeah.
Hi, my name is Josie. I'm studying public health, and my question is about scaling change. You've had an interesting experience for Danny, both running a small business, but also a multi-state, multinational business as well. And I think what we're seeing is big businesses not being able to scale good decisions. And so what advice do you give, not only for people in the restaurant business, but just in business in general, to be able to fulfill those missions at scale and to keep that alive as you grow?
Thank you, Josie. It's the very raison d'etre for my entire career, is trying to figure out how to scale culture. We were having a conversation a little bit earlier that whether we like it or not, no one in the entire history of restaurants has scaled systems more effectively than Ray Kroc, who founded McDonald's. The burger, the fries taste exactly the same no matter where you get them. But he didn't spend a lot of time thinking about scaling culture. He didn't scale a lot of time thinking about how does it feel to dine there? How does it feel to work there? How does it feel? How does this consistently tasting French fry experienced differently in all these different places? And So the one experience we've had with that type of scaling so far is Shake Shack. And there's a motto on this. The CEO is a guy named Randy Garudi, who is 42, and I've worked with him since he was 21 in 5 different restaurants. And we can complete each other's sentences. He happens to be a way better CEO than I would ever be for a public company. But he has 2 things on the wall of his office. One is the original menu that I scribbled out in 2004, and it's only changed by 2 items since that. And the second thing is something that he wrote down, which after we opened our second Shake Shack, which was 5 years after the first. It took us 5 years to open a second Shake Shack. So all this growth has really happened in the last 10 years. But he wrote down, the bigger we get, the smaller we need to act. And that's easier said than done. And so every time we make a decision, we say, are we doing that because we have to, because it got bigger, or are we doing that, or would we have done that if we only had one Shake Shack? And something I'm incredibly proud of, you can scale culture. So if one of the 5 tenets of Enlightened Hospitality is caring for your community, I would argue that because every single Shake Shack decides on a local not-for-profit organization to support with the proviso, we don't push that down to them, with the proviso that the staff members will spend time volunteering there, and that one of our menu items will produce revenue as a percentage of sales for that organization. 100% of every Shake Shack does that. And I can't say that necessarily for 100% of our fine dining restaurants. Everyone is trained and hired with the same set of emotional skills, the hospitality quotient that we call it, just like they are at Union Square Cafe or Gramercy Tavern. And it is the thing that I take probably the most energy from, which is how do you scale culture? And I'm going to finish with one thought. Until about 3 years ago, the 2 most frequent questions I would get from people would be, how do you guys always manage to hire so many nice people? And I could actually answer that because I know what the 6 emotional skills are that are always present at a very high level in someone who is actually happier themselves when they make you feel better. But the second question that I would always get, I just couldn't answer. And the question was, how are you going to possibly sustain your culture even with all this growth? And I go like, I don't know, that's a hard one. And I spoke to a woman who's been very, very helpful to me every 3 years or so. I hit a roadblock. She's kind of like business shrink. And she said, you know, this is not a mathematical question, and it's a philosophical question. And she said, sometimes if you can't answer a philosophical question, the question itself is flawed. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, you keep asking, how can you possibly maintain your culture even with all this growth? And she said, that implies that culture wants to be maintained, or culture can be maintained. You don't ever want to maintain culture. It is, you're probably baking some bread at Chez Panisse right now. I'd like to see you maintain those cultures while the yeast is resting right there. It needs to grow. It needs to move forward, or it dies. And so she said, you need to reframe the question. And I said, all right, well, what is it, Yoda? And she said, you need to say, how can we use our growth to advance our culture? And that was probably the greatest gift I think I've gotten in the last decade. Because now what it shows us is that when we grow, well, first of all, we have to name our culture. We have to name what are the family values, the behaviors that we expect our culture carriers to have. But every time we grow, we must make sure that the people who get the big promotions and the people who get promoted into their place are not only the best at what they know how to do, but who are the best for the people they work with, the best for the culture. And then each time we grow, we are sending a very loud message to everybody. You want that job? You want that promotion? You want that raise? Here's who you have to be while you're doing it. And when you do that, it actually fuels your growth.
Thank you. I'm sitting here just being filled with inspiration. So thank you, Alice, for feeding us this wonderful idea to have this course and sustaining it. Thank you, Saru, for coming and being our special guest. And a special thank you to Danny Meyer.
Thank you. Hold on.
Oh.
I'm going to eliminate the service charge that we've had on the menu for almost 20 years. It's 17%, and we divide it among the cooks and all the waiters. And all the waiters have always had a absolute minimum wage that's really good. Actually, our minimum wage is $17 an hour. But I heard what Danny said today, and I really want to eliminate tipping entirely. Because even with the service charge there, people get the impression it's only at 17 and maybe they should leave a few more dollars. And people do put cash on the table, and the people in the kitchen see them doing that, and the waiters keep that money. And it's in the dining room, and it's not in the kitchen. And I really was convinced by everything that was said. And I'm just going back to the restaurant and make it happen.
I'm gonna make a prediction that we're gonna see more and more organic ingredients in the Union Square Hospitality Group. All right, well, students, we're gonna do attendance, and while Victoria's getting ready, next week, wonderful session about the seeds we sow, the threats to our seed sources, and also a really wonderful entrepreneurial response to a new seed business called Row 7.
All right, everyone. So I feel like this is a pretty boring act to follow, but for those of you who are enrolled in the class and want points for being here today, you know the drill. You're going to kahoot.it, and then you're typing in this pin. General announcement while everybody's getting started. Don't forget that March 6th is when the first essay is due. Please reach out to Will and the teaching team on the Sooner side if you have questions. We're more than happy to talk to you up until March 1st, which I think is next week. So please talk to us sooner rather than later. I'll wait until we get maybe to 100 and then we'll start. All right, let's do it. Okay, so Danny kind of stole my question, but quick pulse of who's worked in the food industry. All right, if you've answered, are they good to go? Yeah. Okay, if you've answered, you're good to go. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. See you next week.